You will spend most of your life afraid of the opinions of people who are not thinking about you. Here's how sure we can be of that. Psychologists once ran a simple, almost cruel experiment. They made a student put on an embarrassing t-shirt, a genuinely awkward one, and walk into a room full of other people. Then they asked the student to guess how many people had noticed the shirt. The student, cheeks burning, was certain that about half the room had seen it and were quietly judging. And then the researchers asked the actual people in the room. The real number who had noticed was a tiny fraction of what the student imagined. Most of them hadn't registered the shirt at all, because they weren't looking at the student. They were thinking about themselves. That gap between how watched you feel and how watched you actually are is one of the most important things you will ever understand. Carl Jung spent his life studying how we become trapped by the imagined gaze of others and how we finally break free of it. And by the end of this, you're going to see the invisible audience you've been performing for your whole life and understand why almost nobody in it is actually watching, and why that is the most liberating fact you will ever accept. Now let me be careful here, because this can land the wrong way. When I say nobody is thinking about you, I do not mean that you don't matter or that you're alone. The people who truly love you think about you all the time. That's real and that's precious, and keep it close. What I mean is something much more specific and much more freeing. The crowd, the strangers, the acquaintances, the vast imagined jury, whose judgment you feel pressing on you every time you try to do something new, or different, or bold. That jury is not watching. They are all far too busy being the anxious star of their own movie to be an extra in yours. Think about how much you've held back because of that imagined jury. The thing you didn't try, the way you didn't dress, the dream you kept small, right? You know exactly what I'm describing. Comment the word watched if you've ever held yourself back, changed how you acted, or killed a dream because you felt everyone was watching and judging. I want to see how universal this is, because it runs almost everyone, and by the end of this you're going to start walking out of that invisible courtroom. Let me show you the spotlight that isn't really there. Here's what psychologists named this, and once you know it, you'll see it everywhere. They call it the spotlight effect. Researchers named Gilovich and Savitsky studied it carefully around the year 2000, and what they found is that human beings dramatically, systematically overestimate how much other people notice them. We each walk around feeling like there is a spotlight on us, tracking our every move, our every flaw, our every awkward moment. And we're certain everyone can see it. Let me give it a simpler name for the rest of this. The phantom audience. The crowd you're always performing for that isn't actually there. And the reason we all suffer from this is not vanity. It's the simple mechanics of being trapped inside one mind. You are the absolute center of your own experience. You are in every single scene of your own life. Your thoughts, your feelings, your embarrassments are the loudest, most vivid things in your entire world. And because they're so overwhelming to you, you naturally assume they're that vivid to everyone else too. But they're not, because every other person is trapped inside their own mind, where they are the center, and where you are, at most, a passing background figure they'll forget by dinner. Think about it honestly. That person who embarrassed themselves in a meeting last week, the one you've completely forgotten about. They are still lying awake replaying it, convinced everyone remembers. That stranger who tripped on the street, whom you stopped thinking about 2 seconds later. They cringed about it all day. We are all doing this to ourselves, all at once, each of us the tortured star of a show that no one else is watching. Your worst, most cringe-inducing moment, the one that still makes you wince years later, has been completely deleted from the memory of nearly every person who witnessed it. They were too busy starring in their own show to save yours. And ask yourself the honest question: how many of other people's embarrassing moments do you actually remember? Go looking for them right now. That coworker who stumbled over their words, that friend who wore the wrong thing, that stranger who said something awkward. Chances are you have to strain to recall a single one, and even the ones you can dredge up, you feel no real judgment about. You just think, "Oh yeah, that happened," and move on. Now here's the part that should set you free. That is exactly how everyone remembers your moments too. Faintly, briefly, without judgment, and then not at all. The mortifying scene you've been carrying like a weight for a decade is, to everyone else, a half-forgotten nothing. You have been serving a sentence for a crime that no one else even remembers witnessing. Now let me show you what this phantom audience actually costs you. Because it is enormous, and it is invisible, which is exactly why it's so dangerous. The imagined gaze of others is one of the single greatest brakes on a human life. It's the reason you didn't raise your hand, didn't ask the question, didn't start the channel, the business, the project, because you pictured everyone watching you fail. It's why you dressed to blend in instead of to feel alive. Why you softened your opinions, shrank your ambitions, and quietly became a smaller, safer, more forgettable version of yourself, all to avoid the judgment of a crowd that was never actually looking. You built your entire life around the reactions of a phantom audience, and it made you small. And here's the cruelest part. The fear feels like caution. It feels like being sensible, humble, appropriate, but it isn't. It's a cage, built out of an illusion, and you're the only prisoner in it, because the guards, the crowd whose judgment you fear, went home years ago. They're not standing watch. They never were. You've been serving a life sentence in a prison whose doors were never actually locked, because you never once tested the handle. Think of one specific thing right now that you would do if you were certain no one was watching or judging. The way you'd carry yourself, the thing you'd finally try. The version of you that's been waiting behind the fear of what people might think. Hold that in your mind, because I'm about to show you that the coast has been clear this whole time. And notice how early this cage was built, because that matters. Most of us learned the fear of the phantom audience as children or teenagers, at exactly the age when we were most self-conscious and least able to see the truth. A teenager genuinely believes the whole school is analyzing their haircut, their clothes, their every stumble. It feels like life or death. And for most people, that teenage certainty never fully goes away. It just goes underground and keeps running the show into adulthood, quietly vetoing choices, still whispering that everyone is watching, still using the panicked logic of a 15-year-old. So part of what you're doing here is not learning something new. It's finally updating a belief you formed before you had the wisdom to question it. You are not that watch teenager anymore. You never actually were. Comment the word cage if you can feel it right now. The specific way the fear of judgment has kept you smaller than you actually are. Naming it is the first crack in the wall. This is where Carl Jung's work cuts right to the center of it. Jung described something he called the persona, the mask. The carefully managed version of yourself that you present to the world, shaped almost entirely by what you believe others expect and will approve of. The persona isn't evil, and you can't live without one entirely. But Jung understood the great danger of it, which is that a person can become so identified with their mask, so consumed by managing how they appear to the phantom audience, that they lose all contact with who they actually are underneath. And that's the real cost of living for the imagined crowd. It's not just that you hold back, it's that, year after year of performing for an audience that isn't watching, you slowly forget there was ever a real self behind the performance. You become the mask. You optimize your entire existence around the approval of people who aren't even looking, and in doing so, you trade away the one thing that was ever truly yours, which is the chance to actually become who you are. Jung called the lifelong process of breaking free of that, of shedding the borrowed mask and becoming your genuine self, individuation, becoming the individual you actually are, instead of the composite of everyone's imagined expectations. And you cannot even begin that journey while you're still terrified of the phantom audience. The first step to becoming yourself is realizing that the crowd you've been performing for was never in the seats. And here's a question worth sitting with. If you stripped away everything you do for the imagined approval of others, what would actually be left? Who would you be? For a lot of people, that question is frightening, because they've spent so long being the mask that they're not sure there's anyone underneath. But that fear is exactly the point. The self is still there. It didn't die. It just got quiet, buried under decades of performance, waiting for you to stop playing to the empty seats long enough to hear it again. Every choice you make for yourself instead of for the phantom audience is you turning the volume back up on a self you were told to keep down. And the more you do it, the louder and clearer that real self becomes, until one day you realize you're no longer performing a life. You're actually living one. Now here is the twist that changes everything, the thing almost no one realizes, and it's strangely beautiful once you see it. Every single person in that phantom audience, every stranger whose judgment you fear, is in the exact same moment terrified of your judgment. Think about that. While you're standing in a room, convinced everyone is silently criticizing you, every other person in that room is standing there, convinced that everyone, including you, is silently criticizing them. The whole world is a room full of people performing anxiously for an audience that is also performing anxiously, and not a single person is actually in the seats. Everyone is on the stage. Everyone thinks they're the only one being watched. And no one is watching anyone, because they're all too busy being watched. It's the most universal illusion there is, and we all suffer it alone, never realizing that the person next to us is suffering the identical thing. The confident-seeming stranger you're intimidated by is intimidated by someone. The person you assume is judging your awkwardness is replaying their own. We are all trapped in separate, private spotlights, each certain we're the only one under one, each performing for a jury made up entirely of other performers who aren't watching. Picture a party, a room full of people, and almost every single one of them is quietly self-conscious. The one by the wall thinks they look like they have no friends. The loud one in the middle is overcompensating, terrified of a silence. The one who left early did so because they were sure they'd said something stupid. Each of them walked away convinced they were the awkward one, the watched one, the judged one. And each of them was far too busy with that private terror to notice, let alone judge, anyone else. The whole party was a room full of people, each starring in their own anxious little film, and the credits rolled with no one having watched a single frame of anyone else's. That party is every room you have ever walked into, including the ones where you were sure all eyes were on you. And here's why that's the most freeing fact you'll ever accept, instead of the loneliest. Because it means the coast is permanently clear, not just today, always. The judgment you fear is structurally impossible, because everyone capable of judging you is far too consumed with being judged themselves. And the moment you truly grasp that, something extraordinary becomes available to you. You can simply step off the stage. You can stop performing. You can walk out of the theater entirely, into your real life, while everyone else stays behind, still performing for empty seats. The person who understands this first gets to be free first. Comment the word free if this just shifted something. If you can suddenly feel how much lighter your life would be without the weight of an audience that was never even there. So here's where I have to challenge something you've probably believed your whole life, because it's the belief that keeps the whole cage locked. You've been taught in 1,000 quiet ways that you should care what people think, that managing your reputation, monitoring how you come across, staying attuned to everyone's opinion of you, is responsible, mature, even considerate, that the fear of judgment keeps you humble and accountable. And so you've spent your life as the diligent manager of your own image, endlessly adjusting yourself to an imagined audience. But here's the inversion. Caring intensely what the crowd thinks of you is not humility. It's actually a kind of hidden grandiosity. It assumes you're important enough to be constantly watched, that you occupy a central place in other people's minds, that in truth you simply don't. The fear of everyone's judgment is secretly the ego's belief that everyone is looking. And letting that fear go isn't arrogance. It's the humble, accurate recognition that you are not the center of anyone's world but your own. Does that reframe sting a little? It's supposed to. Because we like to dress our self-consciousness up as modesty, as being considerate of others, as not wanting to make a scene. But look underneath it honestly, and you'll often find the opposite. The person paralyzed by what everyone will think is, without meaning to be, imagining themselves at the very center of everyone's attention. True humility actually points the other way. It says, gently, I am one of billions, a passing figure in almost everyone's day, and that is not a sad thing. It is a permission slip, because if I'm not that important to the crowd, then the crowd's imagined verdict isn't that important either, and I am free to simply live. Now, I have to be precise here, because there's a wrong way to take this. This is not the message that nobody cares, so nothing matters, so be reckless and cruel and burn it all down. That's not freedom, that's just a different kind of foolishness. The people who genuinely love you do think about you, and their care is real, and you should honor it. Your actions still have real consequences for real people. What you're being freed from is not accountability to the people who matter. It's bondage to the imagined judgment that doesn't. There's a world of difference between living with integrity toward the people you love and living in fear of strangers who forgot you existed the moment you left the room. Drop the second, keep the first. That's the whole art of it. Comment about the one person whose opinion of you genuinely does matter, the one whose care is real. Because the freedom in this video isn't about caring less about everyone. It's about caring about the right few and letting the phantom crowd go. So let's make this real, something you can do this week, because the truth alone won't free you. You have to test the unlocked door. Here's the move. Pick one small thing you've been avoiding purely because of the imagined audience. Not something reckless, something true. Wearing the thing you actually like, speaking up in the meeting, going to the restaurant alone, starting the project in public, something that a small, anxious voice has been vetoing with the words, "But what will people think?" And then do it. And as you do it, run the experiment consciously. Watch how many people actually notice. Watch how many actually care. Watch how the catastrophe you imagined simply fails to arrive, because the audience you feared was never assembled. Each time you do this, the phantom audience gets a little more transparent, and you get a little more free. And here's a phrase to keep. When that anxious voice says everyone will notice, everyone will judge, answer it with the simple truth. No, they won't. They're too busy hoping I don't notice them. Say it and act anyway. And watch reality prove it true, over and over, until the fear finally loses its grip. And start small on purpose, because this is a muscle, not a switch. You don't have to do the most terrifying thing first. You build the freedom in tiny reps. Wear the slightly bolder thing to the store where no one knows you. Speak one honest sentence in a low-stakes meeting. Eat at the counter of a restaurant by yourself for 20 minutes. Each small act where you brave the imagined audience and watch nothing happen is a deposit in a growing account of proof. And proof is what actually dissolves the fear, not willpower. You can't argue yourself out of the phantom audience. You have to show yourself, act by act, that the seats are empty until your own nervous system finally believes it and stops raising the alarm. So here's your job this week. One small act you've been avoiding out of fear of the crowd's judgment. Do it, watch the non-reaction, and feel the door swing open. Because it was never locked, you just have to be willing to walk through it once to finally believe it. And now the deepest layer, the one that turns this from a trick for social confidence into something that can reshape your whole life. When you truly internalize that the phantom audience isn't watching, an enormous amount of energy comes back to you. All the energy you were spending on monitoring, adjusting, managing, performing, all of it returns, and you can finally point it at something real. At becoming good at something, at building something, at actually enjoying your own life, instead of watching yourself live it through imagined eyes. People who break free of the phantom audience often describe it the same way. It feels like they can finally breathe, like they've been holding a pose for decades and are allowed, at last, to relax into their own skin. And there is a strange and wonderful paradox waiting on the other side of this. The person who stops performing for the crowd, who stops desperately seeking its approval, who simply becomes themselves and does their work, is usually the person the crowd ends up respecting most. Because we are all drawn to the one who isn't performing. The one who seems free of the anxiety that secretly grips the rest of us. By giving up the chase for the phantom audience's approval, you often become the rare person who actually earns it. But by then, and this is the beautiful part, you won't need it anymore. You'll be too busy living your actual life to notice. And think about what you could build with all that reclaimed energy. Every hour you've spent rehearsing conversations, replaying embarrassments, wondering what they thought, managing how you came across, is an hour stolen from your actual life. Add it up over years and it's staggering. A second full-time job you never signed up for, working for a boss, the phantom audience, who was never even in the office. Imagine getting all of that back. Imagine pointing that enormous returned energy at a skill, a craft, a relationship, a body of work you actually care about. That is what's on the other side of this. Not just relief from anxiety, but the return of a huge portion of your own life that you'd been quietly handing over to no one. Comment the word reclaim if you're ready to take that energy back, to stop spending your life performing for empty seats and start pointing it at something real. Because that decision, made today, changes everything that comes after. So let's bring it together, because this one shift will change how you walk through every room for the rest of your life. You have spent your life afraid of a phantom audience. The crowd whose judgment you feel is not watching, because every one of them is trapped in their own private spotlight, performing anxiously for a jury of other performers, none of whom are in the seats. The fear of their judgment isn't humility, it's the ego's quiet assumption that you're being watched. And the freedom is not in caring less about the people who love you, but in releasing your bondage to the strangers who forgot you existed. And here's the whole thing in one sentence. The audience you have been performing for your entire life was never in the seats, and the day you truly believe, that is the day you are finally free to become yourself. That's what Jung pointed toward. Not a life of not caring, but a life freed from the mask, freed from the phantom crowd, free at last to do the real work of becoming the individual you actually are. The theater was always empty. You were always free to leave. You just had to look up and see the empty seats, So, the phantom audience, let me bring it home. Remember that student in the embarrassing t-shirt, certain that half the room was judging them, when almost no one had noticed at all? That student is you. That student is all of us, walking through life in our imagined embarrassing t-shirt, certain of a scrutiny that simply isn't happening, shrinking ourselves to avoid a judgment that was never being made. And the tragedy is not the imagined judgment. The tragedy is the life not lived because of it. The dreams kept small, the self kept hidden, the door never tested, all in deference to a crowd that went home before the show even started. So here's what I want you to take from all of this. The next time you feel that familiar pressure, the sense of being watched, of everyone noticing your flaws and judging your choices, I want you to remember the truth. They're not, they can't be. They're every bit as trapped in their own spotlight as you are in yours. And that means the coast is clear. It has always been clear. You can raise your hand. You can wear the thing. You can chase the dream in full view, because no one is watching you fail, and no one is waiting to judge you, because they are all, every one of them, hoping you won't notice them. So stop waiting for an audience that will never take its seats. Step off the stage and go live the life you were too watched to live. And if you feel a flicker of grief reading this, a small sadness that you're not as important to the crowd as you'd hoped, I understand. The ego doesn't give up its imagined importance easily. But stay with the freedom instead, because the same fact that bruises the ego is the one that unshackles the soul. You were never that important to the strangers, which means you were never that judged by them either, which means you were free all along. Let the small grief pass and take the enormous freedom in its place. It is a very good trade. Tell me the one thing you'll finally do now that you know no one's watching. One word or a few in the comments, and I read them. The dream, the change, the version of yourself you've been hiding. Mine for years was my own voice. Because I was so certain everyone was judging it that I kept it quiet until I finally understood the room was empty. And I started speaking. What's yours? Put it down below. And the next time you feel that spotlight burning down on you, remember. Look up. The seats are empty. They always were.